Welcome to the Bluffton Biblecast, where together we embark on an apocalyptic adventure through the prophets and Revelation. Though it's a daunting task, we encourage you to embrace the challenge and find captivating truths from the mysterious parts of God's Word. Thanks for joining us. I'm Steve Ringer. I'm joined by Jamie Steffen and Todd Dreher, and Carter Fichter is running the microphones.
You know, when I was in school, I didn't have much of an appreciation for history class.
And why's that?
Well, it felt like all I was doing was memorizing names, dates, and facts just so I could get an A on the next test or quiz. I didn't have a genuine interest in what had happened years ago because I didn't think it would affect my life moving forward.
That sounds like a pretty typical teenage perspective.
You're right about that.
So, now that you're an adult, has that perspective changed?
It has. I really enjoy reading through history homework with my boys because I now realize that my life has been hugely impacted by what happened in the past.
Okay, Jamie, so now you like history. I know you were planning to talk about Isaiah 45 in this podcast. Is that tied together somehow?
Yes, it does. Because right there in the first few verses of chapter 45, we see a history lesson about a Persian king named Cyrus.
What do we know about Cyrus?
Well, wasn't he involved in a Babylonian takeover the night King Belshazzar saw the handwriting on the wall?
Yep, and do you know how he took over the city that night?
I don't think the book of Daniel gives us those details.
You're right, Todd. The story of the handwriting on the wall is in Daniel 5, but all it says at the end of the chapter is that Belshazzar was killed and Darius took the kingdom.
Wait, Darius? I always say Darius.
Me too.
Anyhow, Darius or Darius took the kingdom? I thought we were talking about Cyrus.
We are. Cyrus did take over the kingdom, but he was acting under the authority of his uncle, Darius, however you want to say it. But that's a history lesson for a different day.
Okay, I think I'm following. So, how do we know exactly what happened that night?
Well, there was an ancient historian named Herodotus who traveled from country to country and wrote about the people and places he encountered. As it happens, one of the events he recorded was the Medo-Persian invasion of Babylon. He talks about how the Euphrates River flowed under the city walls and supplied it with a never-ending source of water.
So the Babylonians probably felt pretty self-sufficient. They had food and water. They could stay there forever.
Yep. And I imagine they felt very safe because they had enormous gates all around the city and even down in the river for extra security.
But obviously they weren't as secure as they thought because we know how this story ends.
You're right. Herodotus tells how Cyrus gained access to the city by diverting the flow of the Euphrates to an outside swamp. Then his men waded through the remaining water under the wall to get to the gate. And as prophesied in Isaiah 45:1, when they got to the gate, it had been left unlocked. They walked right into the city, found the palace gates opened as well, and took Babylon without any bloodshed.
Wait, I want to read Isaiah 45:1 again. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations before him and to loose the belts of kings, to open before him two-leaved gates, and the gates will not be shut.
Wow, that is pretty incredible, especially since Isaiah wrote this verse about 150 years before it actually happened.
I know. Then, after the invasion, Cyrus lets the Jews return to Jerusalem and gives them resources to rebuild the temple.
So, Jamie, why would God appoint Cyrus, a pagan king, to free the children of Israel?
Well, in verse 6, Isaiah writes, speaking on behalf of the Lord, that people may know from the rising of the sun and from the west that there is none beside me. I am the Lord, and there is no other.
It seems that God chose to deliver his people in such an unlikely way and then prophesied it years before it happened so that the children of Israel and everyone would know that he orchestrated it and there is none like him. Throughout last week's reading and into this week's reading, there's been a lot of back and forth contrasting God to idols.
Idol worship must have been a huge problem. It seems like at this point in their journey after the great punishment of the carrying away to Babylon, Israel would have learned their lesson. Worship only God.
Yes, I understand what you're saying, Steve, but to understand why this is such an important topic in these chapters, I think we need to try to understand the Israelite point of view. The Israelites might have felt complete isolation and abandonment from God after what happened. I mean, Israel is the only nation who has a temple to the one true God and are God's chosen people. and yet the whole nation is in ruins. There's no organized worship of God, and the people are far from God's promised land. I can certainly understand how they would start to wonder about God, wonder if he's still the powerful God they once served, and if he's still in control. How could God let this happen?
Although God makes it very clear in the chapters leading up to this week that God himself orchestrated the destruction of Israel and Judah, to the people on the ground, it might have felt like destruction of everything they believed about God, the temple, the people of God, the land of Abraham, and so on.
Yeah, and as we look at chapter 46 this week, the first verse says, Bel bows down, Nebo stoops low. Their idols are borne by beasts of burden.
Bel and Nebo are Babylonian gods. Isaiah goes on to describe how these false idols must be carried and how this is totally different from the God of Israel who carries his people.
Oh, that is a powerful contrast. Idols add weight and burden to people, whereas God carries burdens for his people.
Oh, isn't that so true? As Jesus says in Matthew, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light."
Yes, and then in the next chapter, 47, God is proving his control of the situation by putting Babylon in their place, punishing them for their pride, ungodliness, and bad treatment of God's people.
You know, Todd, chapter 47 is an interesting picture of Babylon. Isaiah describes her as a beautiful, dainty woman who thinks she is the queen of the world.
And then the story takes a turn. This pampered, privileged woman will become a hardworking servant.
Reminds me a little bit of Cinderella's stepmother.
Right. Isaiah even seems to make fun of Babylon's false sense of security. You felt secure in your wickedness, he says, and your wisdom and knowledge led you astray. Then he taunts them to, quote, stand fast in your enchantments and your many sorceries. Perhaps you'll be able to succeed, end quote.
But that clearly is just a taunt, because the chapter is very clear that disaster will fall upon them, reiterating the biblical concept that pride comes before the fall.
Clearly, their idols didn't prevent the fall of Babylon.
Right. If you want some extra reading this week, you could jump back to Isaiah 13, which pairs well with Isaiah 47. We actually skipped this chapter in the reading plan, but it speaks specifically to the destruction of Babylon, and it was prophesied even before Babylon conquered Judah.
In chapter 48, our focus goes back to Israel, and the message seems pretty harsh.
Yeah, I noticed that Isaiah, who's speaking for God, called them the house of Jacob and those who came from the well springs of Judah. Why did he use those names and not the name Israel?
I really think God was trying to get their attention, using the names of Jacob and Judah. As you may recall, Jacob was a deceiver, just as his name represents. Judah had a history that was also pretty brutal. One commentary stated by using these names rather than Israel, God may have been implying they used the name of Israel, but fell very far short of his character.
That reminds me of Peter in the New Testament, when Jesus would use his former name Simon when Peter was out of bounds and needed to be redirected. Like when Peter attempted to chastise Jesus about his upcoming death when they were at Caesarea Philippi.
Yeah, for sure, Jamie. Kind of like when my mom called me by my full name, Stephen Ray Ringer, to let me know I had better listen up.
I read in the first few verses of chapter 48 that God is calling them out for their hypocrisy. They would often use God's name, even pray to the God of Israel, but their hearts were far from God. Like when he states they were obstinate and had necks of iron and foreheads of brass. Right out of the gate, he called them transgressors, even from the womb.
Knowing the depth of their corruption, God still showed them mercy. How deep is the love of God?
Yes, Jamie, he did show them mercy, but not because they deserved it. Isaiah makes it very clear that God intervened and delayed his judgment for the sake of his name. As a result, he was freeing them from the Babylonian exile.
So he was pulling them out of the furnace of affliction. Why does Isaiah use the terms, I have refined you, but not as silver?
Well, Jamie, I'm not really sure, but it could be that the refinement of the people of Israel was not fully complete, just too much dross. Or it could mean that they were more precious to God than silver. In any event, Isaiah was making it clear that the Babylonian exile was meant for their good as God used that affliction to refine them.
This reminds me of the book of James, where he calls us to count it all joy when we come into various trials. Also in Hebrews chapter 12, where we are exhorted not to despise God's chastening, nor be discouraged, but remember that he chastises those he loves.
I love how Isaiah encourages the people of Israel to go forth from Babylon, flee the Chaldeans, shouting the good news and letting the world know that God has redeemed his dear servant Jacob.
Yes, Jamie. Then he emphasizes the urgency by making the statement, there is no peace for the wicked, letting them know staying in Babylon is not a good idea.
With all that God was saying and doing for the land of Israel, they still seemed to question if God was still with them. Maybe their circumstances were so bad they had difficulty seeing the light.
No doubt. But notice how Isaiah communicates the depth of God's love in verses 15 and 16 in chapter 49. He paints a graphic picture of a mother's love for her nursing child. And God's love was even deeper than that. He also describes that Israel's name was engraved in the palms of his hand, never to be forgotten.
When I read that, I thought about the nail-scarred hands of Jesus. His love for his people is truly everlasting.
Speaking of Jesus, is the faithful servant mentioned in the beginning of chapter 49 a reference to the Messiah?
Absolutely. But we're not going to dive into that topic now. We will in chapters 51 through 55. In the meantime, it would be good for our listeners to look for the many prophecies that will be ultimately fulfilled in Jesus.
Well, listeners, we hope you enjoyed diving into the deep waters of Isaiah's prophecy this week. You may need a PFD, prayers for discernment, but it will be worth your time. Thanks for listening.